Well, we have to remember the obvious point. Journalists are one thing, war crimes investigators are quite another, and that should remain the case. And it's important when we come across these sort of evidence of apparent atrocities and war crimes, and I think there'll be a lot more of them. Two things about what we've seen today. First off, this is over 200 miles, and a lot more during war when all the bridges are blown up and it takes so much longer to get to places. At least 200 miles from near Kiev, where you've seen those awful images coming out of Irpin and Bucha in recent days, and the world response to that. So it's in a completely different part of the country. The other point I'd make is this wasn't some peripheral unit of the Russian army. This was an elite tank brigade who was stationed in here and based a lot of the strategy of the war for some 30 days from the town in which we were filming today, not far from where I'm speaking to you now. So those 2 points matter. This is a central unit, and it's happening now in two confirmed, completely discrete places, very different places across Ukraine. And of course, the obvious warning must be repeated. There's distressing material from the outset in our report tonight.
The Ukrainians blew the bridge to stop the westward advance of the Russian army here. And so Trostianets became the Russians' base, and then ensued 30 days of occupation and hell. At a factory at the edge of town, the body of a man of fighting age, hands bound behind his back. The police photographs, too gruesome to broadcast, show his eyes were taped in a blindfold.
Most of the bodies in the mortuary have been tortured to death, and I was surprised almost all of them had gunshot wounds to the back of the head.
It is the car park behind the local council offices. And Anatoly has something to show us.
There was the body of a young man here. His hands were tied behind his back. His trousers were down. There was human excrement on the corpse.
Two men, both fighting age, both apparently shot dead with their hands tied behind them. The body found in this car inspection pit, like the man with his hands tied on the industrial estate, is yet to be identified. Now, we've come to the garden centre. Disturbed ground marks what the police and army believe is a mass grave. They tell us they'll preserve this carefully as a crime scene for potential war crimes investigators. There are not merely suspected mass graves, though, but actual ones. Two more confirmed sites have been disclosed to us here by officials. And beyond this, we have already identified today two further mass grave sites in this town, which we haven't had time to visit yet. Earlier, in the wrecked local council offices, Anatoly had explained how his friend Olena and her husband, both civilians, were shot on the streets of Trostianets. Olena's husband escaped wounded. Her body lay in the street, he said, for 5 days. The town mayor, Yuri Bova, examining one of many burnt-out pieces of Russian armour scattered around this place.
In my estimation, approximately 50 people have been tortured to death or murdered. But this number is only based on the information we have now. We found dead people in a cellar, beaten, with black eyes, with their hands tied behind them so tight it cut into them.
He can list case after case after case of civilians killed here during the 30 days of Russian occupation. The number grows daily as people return here and discover the bodies and the graves. Of course, potential war crimes may not simply be the killing of civilians. There is the deliberate targeting of civilian installations, not least hospitals. They were rightly proud here of the newly refurbished hospital on the edge of town. But now the place stands empty, severely damaged by more than 30 tank shells fired into it. Somehow, someone filmed at least some of it, a Russian tank firing repeatedly at the hospital.
The mayor says Russian soldiers were billeted in this building here before the attack. Now, we know that they were certainly in the vicinity because their uniforms still with the red armbands lying on the ground there. The tank is still in position, the barrel trained on the newly refurbished hospital. The mayor says just before the attack, a senior Russian officer went in, did a tour of the hospital and congratulated them on the place. And then the attack began. He says around 30 tank shells fired into the building, and he is categoric. There was no military presence in the hospital whatsoever.
A reunion in the ruined hospital entrance after the long days of terror. Mercifully, staff and patients were mostly sheltering from the fighting down in the underground bomb shelters when the tank attacked. At the hospital entrance, an eyewitness who confirms independently, without the mayor being here, that a senior Russian officer did indeed search the hospital the day before the attack, asking, "Are there any soldiers here?"
There were no strangers in our hospital except for the Russian Special Forces soldiers. He checked us. He said no problem. He had just one question. Do you have any strangers in this hospital? I said, you are the only stranger here.
Russia absolutely denies targeting civilians in this war. The town's main square, a contortion of destruction. The violence that occurred here is almost unimaginable. But the violence meted out to the civilian population is only just coming to light. In terms of the attacks on the civilian population and the assault on the hospital, they may well amount to war crimes. But that will be for professional investigators to determine. Their work is already underway.
Well, we shall, of course, be bringing you more tomorrow night from the town. And as we said a few moments ago, we discovered one site which we filmed which they suspected might be a mass grave. We also know of two others in that town which they know not only are mass graves, but they know how many bodies are in there. And I underline again, this is just one small town that the wider world's been able to see because the Russian forces have withdrawn and been beaten out of the place, frankly. What on earth is happening down there in Mariupol, where tens of thousands of people are unaccounted for, or even further west along the southern coast, Kherson, where we're getting similar stories, perhaps not in the same sort of numbers, but large numbers of people disappeared and unaccounted for. We can't see either of those places for the obvious reasons. They're occupied by the Russian army. More from here tomorrow night.
Alex, thanks very much. Well, joining me now is Tobias Ellwood, Chair of the Defence Select Committee. Tobias, we've just witnessed yet more apparent evidence of appalling brutality. You know, a body covered in human faeces, for example. Barbaric. I just wanted your reaction, really.
These are terrible scenes that we're seeing, and you have to ask yourself, what will it take for the West to really react and perhaps move up a couple of gears to support the Ukrainians in their hour of need? Britain has done well to support Ukraine prior to the war and providing weapon systems, and indeed afterwards. But we're not doing enough to allow Ukraine to push Russia back. We're not doing enough to stop this sort of brutality. In fact, we've almost given a green light for this activity to take place through our hesitance, through our timidity, which is being exploited by Putin. And I make it really clear that we're going to see more scenes like this as Kharkiv and other places like that are eventually exposed.
Right,
the Russians are pulling out of Kiev. They're going to be pushing into the Donbass region. There's every likelihood they're going to move towards Odessa. If they take the port of Odessa, then Ukraine becomes landlocked. The economy is then destroyed, and Putin then will continue his objectives way beyond Ukraine. So this should be a massive wake-up call for the West.
OK, so let's just unpick some of that. You talk about moving up a couple of notches. Originally, you were asking for a no-fly zone. NATO today reiterated that it didn't want to escalate things. Is that the right response? Or are you now saying, well, we've got to move from defensive weapons to offensive weaponry, or something more when you talk about moving up a couple of notches?
You know, when I served in the armed forces, I fired many of these weapons. There's nothing defensive about an anti-tank weapon. There's nothing defensive about a rifle. These are offensive weapons. And I can't believe we're still having semantic debates about this. We see the Czech Republic now wanting to to gift tanks. That's what the Ukrainians are asking for. Poland wanted to move its MiG-29s across as well. This is the sort of activity that we need to be looking at. And I go back to Odessa. We could easily provide a humanitarian zone around the port, linking the port to international waters. That would be a robust stance to take against Russia. It will be monitoring this from an escalatory perspective, which wouldn't see everything suddenly ratchet up towards World War III or indeed a nuclear war, which is what we seem to be spooked about.
But it sounds like you're saying we're already involved anyway. We're already in this war to all intents and purposes.
Yes, this is why I don't understand why it's taking so long to get where we're going. Yes, we are learning. We're learning fast, but not quickly enough. We're doing enough to ensure that Ukraine doesn't lose, but not enough to allow them to win. They are doing all the heavy lifting here. And I think the MOD recognises it wants to do more. But I think it's now time that Britain looks to break away and form a coalition of the that's willing to step forward to support Ukraine in the way it's requesting.
So whatever Ukraine is asking for, you would like to see the UK supplying with whoever else is available?
Not just not just Britain, but other nations as well. They are running out of ammunition. They're running out of fuel. They're running out of the lethal weapons that they are requesting, the large and small ones as well. Until they get these systems in, then we'll see more scenes such as we're seeing in Bucha and Mariupol take place as well. I stress, there's another chapter to this war. It's far from over.
But isn't Russia looking for just such action as an excuse to target beyond Ukraine?
You've seen how Russia twists the message, how they're selling this back in Russia, some form of patriotic war. The majority of Russians actually, bizarrely, continue to support Putin. He doesn't need any excuse to ratchet this up, but we are finding excuses not to help Ukraine. And as I make it very, very clear, this won't stop with Ukraine. We're seeing countries such as Germany and Poland, I've just come back from those two countries, and others, increase their defense budgets because they recognize we've entered a new era of insecurity. This is not just about Ukraine. This is about European security and what we're going to do about it.
Do you think anyone will be held accountable for what's going on, what we've just seen on our screens tonight?
You know, it's a really good question. And this is what we want to do, ensure that we collect evidence. But I served in Bosnia, I've been to Rwanda. It takes many, many years for these people to be brought to account in The Hague. And don't forget, Russia pulled out of the ICC in 2016. So no general, no soldier will be going anywhere near The Hague anytime soon. Yes, keep collecting that evidence, but ultimately Putin is here to stay. There'll be no purge, there'll be no coup in Russia for the moment. This is very much a war that we need to, wise up to and develop the statecraft that we saw during the Cold War to better be able to assess risk and indeed take calculated risk.
Tobias Ellwood, thanks very much for joining us. Well, amid fears that Russia is now preparing to regroup and launch an even more ferocious attack in the east, Ukrainian officials have urged people there to flee while they can or face the threat of death. Amid the international outrage over Russia's atrocities in Bucha and elsewhere, Britain and the US announced more sanctions against Moscow, with the UK pledging to end imports of Russian oil and gas by the end of the year. Paul McNamara reports, and again, there are distressing images in his report.
Bombardment and blockade, and now desperation on a deplorable scale. Thousands in the besieged city of Mariupol queuing for the basics of survival. The aid delivered here is draped in cruel irony and the Russian Z for victory. Ukrainians handed food and water gifted by the regime that robbed them of their homes and their safety, though in the extremes of exhaustion, many are just grateful for any small mercies.
It's been so difficult, and this aid is extremely necessary, and it's come just in time.
This is a city almost completely destroyed, yet destroyed further daily with yet more Russian artillery. And this is what remains of the theatre where it's believed 300 souls perished. City officials now believe tens of thousands of civilians are likely to have died in Mariupol since the war began. And today they claim Russia has deployed mobile crematoria. Their purpose? Destroy all evidence of their crimes.
The revelations that we're seeing from what Putin has done in Ukraine, which, you know, doesn't look far short of genocide to me, it is no wonder that people are responding in the way that they are. And I have no doubt that the international community, Britain very much in the front rank, will be moving again in lockstep to impose more sanctions and more penalties on Vladimir Putin's regime.
It's not just Putin's regime being targeted, but Putin's daughters, one of which seen here on the right, today sanctioned by the US. Russia's largest bank, Sberbank, and Credit Bank of Moscow have been hit with asset freezes by the UK, and 8 more oligarchs have been added to the sanctions list too. Russia says these are rebels they back fighting in the eastern city of Luhansk. The pictures pumped out by Russian state TV. The shelling you can hear dropped, Russia says, by Ukrainian forces. The plea by Ukraine's authorities to those still trapped in this eastern region today: flee by any means, in expectation of a fresh Russian onslaught.
We are now in the critical phase of the war. We see that Russia is moving forces out of the north to reinforce them, to resupply them, to rearm them, and then to move them into the east, where we are expecting a major offensive.
My brother, he cries for the man beneath the makeshift shroud. In Bucha, 15 miles from Kyiv, the streets have become morgues, only visible now in Russian retreat. All this, though, say Russia, is staged by Americans and American media. One last Russian insult to their victims, not just denying them dignity in death, but denying them truth.
Paul McNamara reporting there, and Paul joins me now. Paul, you've got more on the sanctions, haven't you?
Yeah, so we heard there more details on more US sanctions, more UK sanctions. What we didn't hear was signed off more EU sanctions. And what we've got really here is the brutal reality of pan-European moral outrage coming face to face with the cost of living crisis and real-world politics. So we believe that there is broad agreement among the EU 27 ambassadors for one of the things I was told, quote, a ban on imports from wood to cement, from seafood to liquor, and that's aimed at cutting off oligarch money-making. They value that about €5.5 billion. Also, this is a biggie, a ban on coal imports. That's worth about £4 billion per year. But what there isn't an agreement on is anything on oil and gas. And that's because Europe is much more reliant on Russian oil and gas. It's about 40% of natural resources that come from Russia. We understand that the two biggies kicking back here are Germany and Hungary. Germany particularly reliant on Russian energy. Hungary, though, you've got right-wing Viktor Orban, who has recently been re-elected, and of course he got a congratulatory note from Vladimir Putin. Now look, it's expected that the European sanctions will be signed off in the next couple of days. We'll hear lots of rhetoric about wanting to hit Russia economically, but don't expect to hear anything on oil and gas, which are the big cash cows. And just remember this, since the beginning of this war, 35 billion euros of European money has flowed to Russia. That's about €1 billion a day. That's a lot of money if you want to hurt Russia economically.
Paul, thanks very much. Well, joining me now is the Ukrainian MP, Lesia Vasilenko, who's in Kyiv. Lesia Vasilenko, thanks very much for coming on the programme. Every night we see more emerging evidence of appalling atrocities, apparent atrocities carried out by the Russians in towns they've left behind. What impact is this having on people there in Ukraine?
It angers us and it makes us more and more determined to fight until victory and to fight until the very last soldier, Russian soldier, leaves the Ukrainian soil. I mean, if Russia wanted to demoralize the people and to make us live in fear and in terror, they have failed. They have failed big time. Now what you will be seeing is people coming back to Bucha and Irpin, and some of them are already back. Others are waiting impatiently. They don't want to seek refuge in other parts of Ukraine. They don't want to go abroad. They want to go back to their homes, to build their homes. and fight off this plague of Russian aggression, which is spreading across Ukraine.
I mean, it's really heartbreaking looking at your Twitter account. You've been tweeting, for example, about portable crematoriums in the last few days. Do you and others have evidence that you think will enable convictions, war crimes convictions?
What I tweet is what I get from the official channels, the information that we receive in Parliament from government officials and from different sources in intelligence, which are allowed bits of information which are allowed to be made public. So yes, this is verified information, and it breaks my heart every time I write those words about a new bout of Russian atrocities which are happening in Ukraine and which the Russian soldiers are committing as to the people of Ukraine. But really, I think that the world needs to know the truth, and if any goal is to be achieved, is for the political leaders of the free world to actually wake up and to start taking a stronger stance against Russia's aggression.
So you don't think the West is doing nearly enough to, comply with what Ukraine is asking of it?
The situation was Bucha, Irpin, and all of the other villages around Kiev. They showed us just the barbarity and the extent of the barbarity to which Russia is prepared to go to. I'm afraid that in Mariupol and in Izium, the occupied city, in the Kharkiv region.
Lesia, I'm afraid we've lost you, I'm afraid. I'm sorry to cut you off there, but we'll try and come back to you if we get you back. Lesia Vasilenko there, Ukrainian MP. Well, President Biden has just been speaking at a trade union conference in Washington, D.C., where he gave more details on the new sanctions the US has imposed on Russia. Let's get the latest from Kate Fisher in Washington. Kate.
Well, this escalation in sanctions from Washington in response to the escalations of atrocities in Ukraine. The largest financial institution in Russia, Sberbank, as well as the biggest private bank, Alfa Bank, both under total blocking sanctions, which means there can be no transactions with them, with American individuals or entities, save for the energy sector. The White House saying that means that now more than 2/3 of Russia's banking sector is under these tough American sanctions. They are also going to ban new American investment in Russia. They say that will mean this mass exodus of American corporations from the country will endure, and it will also mean that there's something of a brain drain, no more skill or technology from the US going into Russia. And sanctions on more individuals, and these are creeping closer and closer to Vladimir Putin himself. Both of his adult daughters now under sanction, as well as his foreign minister Sergei Lavrov's wife and daughter. And President Biden is saying that they believe that Putin tries to hide his wealth with family members, but also he made it clear earlier today just why he continues to go after the people closest to the center of Russian power.
These oligarchs and their family members are not allowed to hold on to their wealth in Europe and the United States and keep these yachts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, their luxury vacation homes, while children in Ukraine are being killed, displaced from their homes every single day. Russia wanted to take Ukraine's capital city, Kyiv, and topple its democracy and elected government. Today, Kyiv still stands, and that government still presides. This fight is far from over.
President Biden again reiterating there will be no quick nor easy resolution to this conflict. Tomorrow, the US expected to impose further sanctions, this time on state-owned enterprises.
Kate Fisher, thanks very much for joining us. Well, joining us now is a retired colonel and former defence advisor to Ukraine, Liam Collins, who helped train and reform Ukraine's military between 2016 and 2018. Colonel, how big a moment do you think it is when you see Russia retreating from around Kyiv and the northeast of Ukraine, north of Ukraine, I should say?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely a sign of success for the Ukrainians and a failure by the Russians. I mean, Putin can try to paint it however he wants, but that was their primary objective, was the capital, and they've given up on that and are kind of resulting in whatever win they can get. So that's very significant.
And you can say it is a military defeat.
Yes, the attempt to take the capital in the north is definitely a defeat. The war, again, is far from over, but that that portion and that primary objective that they had, that was a defeat for the Russians.
And why would you say, looking at it, why would you say that Russia has failed in that primary objective?
Well, I mean, initially it was right to have the Zelensky regime fall, which didn't happen. And then it was to regroup around the capital and just shell it into submission. And then that didn't work. And so they pulled out and there's no troops anywhere near the capital. So that means that was not a success for them and they failed.
Sorry, I meant what reasons do you give for that failure? What do you blame?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. I mean, they failed because they didn't have a strategy. Warfighting is a function of many things, right? Strategy, doctrine, training, leadership, the will to fight, and weapon systems. And the only thing Russia had the advantage in was the combat weapon systems. In every other category, from the will to fight to the leadership to training, Ukraine was better than them. And that's why Ukraine was able to ultimately defend against them and push them out.
I mean, is that pattern likely to be replicated in the east of Ukraine or not? Do you think we're going to see something very different there?
I would expect to see it similar, but again, it's a matter of Russia's ability to mass its forces with its overwhelming combat power against a better fighting Ukrainian military. And so, just like in sports, right, you just don't know how things are going to play out until they actually are engaged on the battlefield. But I would expect it to be similar, that Ukraine will beat them at the tactical level when they can fight on their terms.
So it is possible that Ukraine could win this?
I mean, it's war. I mean, by win, meaning Russia leaves, but they're going to have billions of dollars of damage, all kinds, right? There's no winners in war, only losers. But, you know, Russia can definitely lose this for sure. And Ukraine, you could call it a win, but again, significant amount of damage and loss of life.
Of course, of course. What does Ukraine need from the West, from NATO, to enable it to get the upper hand and to defeat Russia?
Yeah, they just need to get the replacement on the weapon systems that they're expending while the fight continues to go on, right? They're attriting their anti-tank weapon systems, for example, armed drone, you know, to fly in the sky and drop weapon systems on exposed Ukrainian vehicles, right? Anti-aircraft missiles, bullets, artillery shells, right? Counter battery radars to identify where their Russian artillery is. But basically every weapon system that they have, they need replacements for.
And we heard from a Conservative MP who's chair of the Defence Select Committee earlier on the programme, who said that the West and the UK and allies need to really step this up a couple of notches. Do you agree with that assessment? Do you agree with his assessment that NATO has been somewhat timid so far?
No, I think, I mean, the response has been probably what it should be. I mean, if we should have done more, it would have been before the battles, before Russia invaded Ukraine and made sure that Russia knew that, and it effectively deter Russia from invading in the first place. But now, where we're at now, I think the West's response has been appropriate. Sanctions have been fairly swift and severe. They could be a little more severe, I think, against Russia. But they're getting the weapon systems they need. I don't think a no-fly zone, for all the reasons people have said, is the answer. Instead, right, provide Ukraine with armed drones and anti-aircraft missiles. That's what they need, those kind of things, as opposed to a no-fly zone.
What about tanks? Because we've seen the Czechs supplying tanks. Is that something that the UK, the US needs to do?
I mean, we're not going to probably send our tanks over there. I don't see that happening. And we don't necessarily need that, you know, it's what's the capability. So without a doubt, they probably need some tanks. But I think if you're giving them anti-tank weapon systems, other capabilities, they can compensate for having fewer tanks, for example.
We have seen such horrors in the last few weeks. And I just wonder whether you think anyone will be held accountable for what we've seen, whether a war crimes tribunal, we're going to see Putin in the dock or not.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely not. I think you want to collect the evidence. You want to say what they did, effectively name and shame, so we know what they did and who did it. But Russia's not a member of the International Criminal Court. They're never going to send someone to be prosecuted. They don't follow Western norms, and they never have. And so no one will actually be personally held accountable in a court of law. That will not happen.
Colonel Liam Collins, thank you very much for your time.